All right, for chapter 20, we're going to be looking at the infectious diseases that affect the gastrointestinal tract. So the GI tract is a long tube called the alimentary canal that extends from the mouth to the anus. And so we have lots of organs here, and then we have our accessory organs. We have 8 main sections of the gastrointestinal tract. That's going to be the mouth, pharynx, esophagus, then the stomach, small intestines, large intestines, rectum, and anus. Then we've got 4 accessory organs. Those are going to be in digestive fluids as well, enzymes that will help in digesting and processing food. That's going to be our salivary glands, liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. So the GI tract has many, many microorganisms and encounters millions of new ones every day. It has many defenses against infection that are very important. All of the intestinal surfaces are lined with a layer of mucus. You have secretory IgA that can be found on most surfaces. You have the muscular walls of the GI tract that keep food and microorganisms moving through the body through the action of peristalsis. You have saliva, which contains lysozyme and lactoferrin. The stomach fluid is going to be very acidic, so that's antimicrobial. Bile is also antimicrobial. We have gut-associated lymphoid tissue, which are actually packets of lymphoid tissue in the GI tract. These are going to be consisting of T cells and B cells, as well as some features of non-specific immunity. It can produce IgA, but also perform a large variety of other functions. We've got the tonsils and the adenoids in the oral cavity in the pharynx. We have small areas of lymphoid tissue in the esophagus. We have Peyer's patches, which are lymphoid tissue in the intestines. We have the appendix, which can act in immunity as well. We have many, many commensal organisms that actually live in the system, especially in the large intestine. Many beneficial relationships as well. We've got E. coli, which actually produces vitamin K, many others. Many of these actually also avoid immune destruction by cloaking themselves with host sugars that are found in the intestinal walls. So we are learning more and more every day that the normal biota of the gastrointestinal tract has a much larger role in overall organismal health. So we've found that it's very important, a lot more important than we once realized. The oral cavity alone has more than 600 known species of microorganisms. This is going to include Streptococcus, Neisseria, Staphylococcus, Lactobacillus, Corynebacterium, Treponema species. Fungi like Candida albicans are also numerous. Even some protozoa, Trichomonas, into Amoeba gingivalis, also called the mouth home. Many species live in large associations known as dental plaque. That is a biofilm, a type of biofilm. And so bacteria held in the biofilm by specific recognition molecules. There's lots of studies underway about these particular microbiota as well in the mouth. They're even studying the relationship between the oral cavity microbiota and heart health. And even looking back in the long periods of time and studying what people ate and trying to figure that out by the normal microbiota in their mouth. We also have alpha hemolytic streptococci, and these are actually some of the first colonizers on the tooth surface after it has been cleaned. So other species are going to attach to things like a pellicle. We have a pellicle, which is a mucinous glycoprotein covering on the tooth, and streptococci attached to that. Some are going to attach to other proteins or sugars on the surface of the streptococci. So while you'll notice our respiratory chapter was one of the shortest, this system has so many normal microbiota and so many diseases that this is actually one of the longer 1. So those kind of balance each other out. So in the pharynx, we also have a variety of microorganisms that we looked at in some of the same organisms we looked at in Chapter 19, Bacillus, Clostridium, Staphylococcus, Streptococcus. Those are all permanent residers generally. It used to be thought that it was once sterile because it is a very low pH, but we have found that there's at least 128 different species of microorganisms that are found in the stomach. Some of these guys are just passing through, while others are actually permanent residents. Let's see, we have many normal microbiota for the large intestines. We've always known that it had many microbes. Over 1,000 per 1 gram of stomach contents, okay? Here we'll find bacteria like Bacteroides, Bifidobacterium, Clostridium, Enterobacteria, E. coli, Lactobacillus, Peptostreptococcus, Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, Candida, several protozoan, and even some archaeal species, which is kind of crazy, okay? And so remember, these all help function with help the body to function normally. They aid in digestion. They actually provide nutrients that we cannot make ourselves, like vitamin K. Accessory organs and internal organs now are going to be free of microorganisms, but the GI tract is going to have many. All right, so on to diseases, and you're going to learn more in this chapter about diarrhea than you ever wanted to know, as far as causes anyway. We have many things that can cause diarrhea. So we're going to look first at acute diarrhea, and this is going to be defined as 3 or more loose stools within a 24-hour period. On average, most people in the U.S. experience 1.2 to 1.9 cases of diarrhea per person per year. For children, that is double, okay? In developing countries, many experience more than 10 episodes of diarrhea per year. This is often due to not being able to have access to clean water, or being able to have clean water to do things like general cleaning in the household, that type of thing as well. Over 700,000 infants a year can die from diarrhea. Children that survive are likely to have permanent and physical cognitive deficits if they have dozens of bouts with diarrhea in a year. Often, acute diarrhea will be accompanied by abdominal pain, fever, cramping, nausea, vomiting, and of course, dehydration is a big concern. About 1/3 of acute diarrhea in the U.S. is transmitted on contaminated food. So we can have about 48 million people become sick due to contaminated food. About 3,000 of those can die. Many diarrhea episodes are actual self-limiting and don't require treatment. Others, like E. coli, certain strains of E. coli can have very devastating effects because they can also affect other organs like kidneys. In most diarrheal illnesses, antimicrobial treatment is contraindicated. It can actually make it worse, but occasionally with something like shigellosis, quick treatment with antibiotics is actually necessary. So it's important to know which agents are causing the diarrhea, but in most cases, identification is not performed unless it continues. So we have many enteric bacteria that can cause acute diarrhea. These can be divided into serotypes or subtypes. So we have gram-negative enteric, which means intestines basically, are named and is designated according to their antigens. And so we have the H, K, and O antigens. Flagellar, capsular, and cell wall is how we can differentiate between those particular species. So Salmonella enterica is our first species we are looking at. About 10 years ago, almost one out of every 3 chickens was contaminated with Salmonella. Today's rate is much, much lower, about 10%, which is great news. Other poultry, of course, like ducks and turkeys, can also be affected. Eggs are also affected because bacteria can enter the egg when the shell is actually being formed. This is a very large genus of bacteria, but the disease condition is caused by the subspecies, usually enterica, okay? We have Salmonella enterica, okay? That's the first subspecies, and we also have the serovariant Salmonella typhi, and that's usually just called Salmonella typhi. These are motile. These can ferment glucose and sometimes even gas. Most produce hydrogen sulfide, and so this is going to determine what test we do. These will grow very readily on laboratory media. These survive outside of the host in any, not in any, but in an inhospitable environment. They're resistant to bile and to different dyes. These are normal intestinal biota in many species, including cattle, poultry, rodents, and reptiles. And it, of course, has been a documented source of infection and disease in humans for a long time. This is spread by the fecal-oral route and via vehicle transmission. So Salmonella can cause salmonellosis, that is disease, and that can include having a very high fever, septicemia, if it is severe. If you have a milder form, you can have vomiting, diarrhea, and irritation of the mucosal lining. So blood can appear in the stool. In a healthy adult, your symptoms should clear up in about 2 to 5 days. But if you are immunocompromised or have some other susceptibility, you may need to have further treatment. Death does not usually occur unless there is a pre-existing type condition. It does have the ability to adhere to the mucosa in the gut, which increases its virulence. It also has an endotoxin, of course, that increases its virulence as well. It has an infectious dose of about 50, and of course, remember that's how many organisms that have to be ingested to cause disease. That's kind of a high infectious dose. Animal products like meat and dairy products, of course, can be contaminated with salmonella during the slaughter, collection, and processing of those particular products. All right, and so as a result, this has been transmitted in foods, and we've seen this increase as the long-term shipping, so to speak, across the U.S. has occurred, and we're no longer getting things on a local basis. So in 2016, there was a salmonella outbreak that actually included meal replacement shakes. We hear it frequently in meats or vegetables, but that was kind of an odd one. Most cases are going to be traceable to a common food source like milk or eggs, which is probably where it came from for the meal replacement shakes. And the only prevention is avoiding contact with the bacterium. Uncomplicated cases of salmonellosis, you need fluid replacement and electrolyte replacement and antibiotic treatment for somebody that is immunocompromised, or if the disease is severe, would be sulfamethoxazole and trimethoprim. Next, we have Shigella, which can cause shigellosis. This is a non-endospore forming gram-negative rod. It is non-mobile. It will not produce urease or hydrogen sulfide. This is primarily a human parasite, but it can also infect apes. It's going to produce a very similar disease that vary in intensity among the subspecies, resembles a little bit of the pathogenic strains of E. coli. And so you're going to see very frequent watery stools, fever, of course, intense abdominal pain, nausea and vomiting. Can cause a dysentery, which is diarrhea containing blood. In Shigella, the stools most often are going to have blood, and even more often to have what we call occult blood. You have mucus, of course, in the GI tract that can also be found in stools. This is going to have a fecal-oral transmission or direct contact. And this is going to have endotoxin and enterotoxin, and some species will have a Shiga-Toxin. So Shigella can actually invade the lining of the intestine through the villi, rather than in the large intestine, not the small intestine. It doesn't necessarily perforate the intestine or invade the blood, as some species do. It will enter the intestinal mucosa by going through special cells in the Peyer's patches. Once it gets in the intestinal mucosa, it can cause an inflammatory response that can cause an extensive destruction of the tissues. It can release an endotoxin causing fever, the enterotoxin. The exotoxin can affect the GI tract, damaging the mucosa and the villi. And then those that have Shiga toxin seem to cause more serious damage to the intestines, as well as some overall systemic effects. This is going to have, here in this picture, you have a normal GI tract and the effects of Shigella below that. So normal on the top, and what happens after you have Shigella on the bottom. All right, you can see that's very, very inflamed. And so you don't have perforation, however, which can happen with things like C. diff, Clostridium difficile. This is going to be an oral route, direct person-to-person contact. It's going to have a very small infectious dose, can be as small as 10 bacteria. And the disease is mostly going to be associated with poor sanitation, malnutrition, or overcrowding. And so it's spread epidemically in daycare centers, prisons, mental institutions, nursing homes, areas where people are in close quarters with each other. This can also cause a chronic carrier condition in some people that can last several months long. The only prevention here is proper hygiene and avoiding contact with infected persons, okay? All cases of shigellosis should be treated with antibiotics, sulfamethoxole and trimethoprim. Some may be sensitive to ciprofloxacin if it's resistant to the others. So some strains of E. coli are able to produce the Shiga toxin, and so these are Shiga-Toxin-Producing E. coli, abbreviated as STEC. E. coli infections are often transmitted by the fecal contaminated water, sometimes by food, often due to undercooked meat. They can involve enterotoxin that can be causing things like traveler's diarrhea. And sometimes they can be self-limiting, with the only treatment being rehydration. And so the Shiga toxin producing is going to have symptoms from a mild gastroenteritis into a bloody, more severe diarrhea. So you can have hemolytic uremic syndrome, can be a more serious consequence. And so this is going to have symptoms like increased blood urea nitrogen, creatinine levels being off, and also some very acute renal failure. So that's going to be the more serious effects of this. Dozens of E. coli strains exist, and many of these don't even cause disease at all. They're not virulent. But these sugar-producing toxin ones are. You can also have some neurological symptoms like blindness, strokes, and even seizures. So the most common way for this to be transmitted is via undercooked beef. Other foods, of course, and beverages can transmit as well. Chipotle was actually the source, you may remember, of 2 distinct E. coli outbreaks in the U.S. in 2015. They were shut down for a while as a result. The CDC gives recommendations. Some of these are going to be to not eat raw cookie dough, those types of things. And so you can confirm the infection of this with a stool culture. You can also do a test for a Shiga toxin. Positive specimens need to be sent to the state or local health department so they can monitor the outbreak. Best prevention for this is going to be good hygiene. Shiga toxin is going to be heat labile. E. coli is killed by heat as well. Antibiotics are going to be contraindicated for this infection because that may increase the pathology by causing it to release more toxin. So you would want to do supportive therapy. You can even do, if it's severe enough, plasma transfusion to dilute the toxin in the blood. That's another good option there. E. coli is, of course, gram-negative. There are 5 other categories of E. coli that can actually cause diarrheal diseases. We have enterotoxigenic E. coli, ETEC, enteroinvasive, EIEC, enteropathogenic, EPEC, diffusely adherent, okay, and enteroaggregative, all right. So usually they want to differentiate the Shiga toxin producing strains from the other strains. This is, I'm not sure if I said it already or not, but this is also going to be gram-negative. Campylobacter jejuni, and there are some other pathogenic species of Campylobacter, is one of the most common bacterial causes of diarrhea, at least in the U.S. The signs and symptoms are going to be frequent and watery stools, vomiting, fever, headaches, abdominal pain. Sometimes these may last for longer than 2 weeks. This is going to be spread fecal-oral route, vehicle transmission. This also has exotoxins and adhesins as virulent factors. This is going to be a curved or spiral gram-negative bacteria. It's going to have polar flagella, maybe amphitrichus in the flagella as well. And this can be often in kind of an S shape or gull-winged type shape in pairs. Okay, it's a microaerophile. Of course, it inhabits the intestinal tract, genitourinary tract, and oral cavity of humans and animals as well. This can be transmitted by ingesting contaminated fluids, water, milk, but also via things like meat and chicken as well. Once injected, Campylobacter jejuni can reach the mucosa at the last segment of the small intestine near the junction with the colon, and there it's going to adhere and actually burrow through the mucus and then begin to multiply. And so symptoms can begin within 1 to 7 days. It's going to be the incubation period. It has a heat labile enterotoxin, which can cause a stimulation of diarrhea that is similar to that of cholera. Sometimes infection can also lead to a neuromuscular paralysis. This is what's called Guillain-Barré syndrome. 20 to 40% of Guillain-Barré cases are going to be preceded by an infection with Campylobacter. So in order to resolve the infection here, you're going to have very simple, non-specific rehydration, electrolyte balance. If it is severe, then you may treat with erythromycin or azithromycin if necessary. There are some instances of antibiotic resistance here. No vaccine. Treatment, you need to have rigid sanitary control of water and milk supplies, very careful preparation with food. Next is Clostridium difficile, or C. diff. This is a gram-positive microbiota. It can form endospores, and it is normal flora or normal microbiota for many people, most people. Although it can become out of bounds. And so most of the time you're going to see infections from this is going to be preceded by use of broad spectrum antibiotics for a while, and it can cause a very severe painful colitis. It can also superinfect the large intestine and produce 2 different enterotoxins, enterotoxin A and enterotoxin B, and this can cause a devastating necrosis to the wall of the intestine. The colitis is that superinfection, and it's going to have disruption of normal flora. Because of those, like I said, broad spectrum antimicrobials, major cause of diarrhea in hospitals, long-term care facilities. Severe cases can show up with severe abdominal cramping, fever, leukocytosis. The colon can be inflamed and actually slough off the lining there. You can have membrane-like patches that's called pseudomembranes that consist of fibrin and cells, and if it's not stopped, you can actually have perforation of the cecum and death. This is pretty serious. A little over 60% of C. diff cases are health associated, okay? And so this is a big concern in facilities that have a number of patients. Although a lot of times about a quarter of these cases will not show up until after the patient goes home, okay? So this is a real important one for anybody, like I said, working in a hospital, long-term care facility, because we act as vehicles of transmission, and of course the patients or the residents there are going to be highly susceptible to this. So when treating Clostridium difficile, if you are receiving antibiotics, then you need to stop the antibiotics, okay? Stop the antibiotic first. In more mild infections, you can start with metronidazole and move on up to sometimes Flagyl or vancomycin. Vancomycin, of course, is one of the last resort antibiotics. This can be very difficult to eradicate, and stubborn infections can really affect a patient's quality of life. C. diff releases endospores, and those contaminate the environment. So this is part of the reason this is so bad in the hospitals and long-term care facilities, because it's very easy to spread with that. So patients have to be in isolation, and they need to have very rigorous disinfection and infection control. And so these things are really important for us in health, or those in the healthcare industry, to pay attention to. All right, so here we have Vibrio cholerae. Vibrios are usually rods. They do sometimes have a curved shape, a slight curve to them. Single polar flagellum. These are frequently isolated with cells that remove very quickly. They almost look kind of like a comma in their curved shape. And so they have many characteristics that are shared with other enterobacteria. These are fermentative. They can grow on ordinary or selective media. These have very unique O and H antigens and membrane receptor antigens. It has an incubation period from a few hours to even a few days, and you will have sudden symptoms of vomiting with a copious, which means a very large amount of watery feces. That's sometimes called secretory diarrhea, and it has kind of the color of water that you've boiled rice in, and so they call this a rice water stool. So very large amounts of diarrhea. And so with that, you are, of course, going to become severely dehydrated, and so you'll have a loss of blood volume. You can have acidosis, thirst, sunken eyes, hypotension, tachycardia, and even shock. So fluid losses of up to 1 liter per hour have been recorded, which is just very, very drastic. Untreated, if severe enough, a patient can lose up to 50% of their weight during this. All right, this is a very serious diarrheal disease. Acidosis occurs because of bicarbonate loss and potassium depletion due to the diarrhea. Then you can have, of course, an onset of muscle cramps, thirst, flaccid skin, sunken eyes, coma, and even seizures. You can have some secondary consequences of things like hypotension. Of course, if you lose your blood volume, you're going to lose your blood pressure. Hypo means below. Tachycardia. And even cyanosis, okay? And then within 18 to 24 hours, if severe enough, you can even have shock occur, okay? Untreated death can occur in less than 48 hours, and the mortality rate is 55 to 70%. This is not necessarily really bad in the U.S., but this is something that you do see in developing countries. This has a very, very high infectious dose, 10 to the 8th cells, so add 7 more zeros behind that 10. These will actually get through the mucus barrier at the junction for the duodenum and the jejunum, and then adhere to the microvilli there and start to multiply. These don't actually get into the host cells, however. The virulence is going to be caused by the enterotoxin, which is called cholera toxin, okay? Easy to keep that one straight, right? And this actually kind of disrupts the normal physiology of your intestinal cells. Your cells, again, are going to shed a large amount of electrolytes. And of course, that's going to cause a profuse water loss. This is going to be influenced greatly during transmission by it's seasonal. So the season, time of year, that type of thing, climate. Cold, acidic, dry climates can slow the migration and survival of Vibrio, okay? Warm, monsoon, saline type of climates will favor it. So cholera is one of the top 7 causes of morbidity and mortality worldwide. It can affect up to several million people in areas like Asia and Africa. In areas like the U.S., it is spread by contaminated food and water or asymptomatic carriers. The most important treatment is going to be water and electrolyte replacement, because that's what's going to cause the severe symptoms. Vaccines are available for people traveling to areas where this is going to be endemic. Prevention is going to be based on clean water. All right, so proper sewage treatment and water purification. This is why you see an increase of this in areas that are developing countries because they don't have access to clean water. So Vibrioses are going to be non-cholera species of Vibrio. 2 species are the most prominent. That's the vulnificus here and the parahemolyticus. These can actually come from exposure to seawater or by eating contaminated shellfish. So this is just another alternative here for a non-cholera contamination of Vibrio. Next, we have Cryptosporidium, which is an apicomplexan protozoan. This can infect many different species, including mammals, birds, and reptiles. It is zoonotic, and it does have, of course, similar symptoms to the other gastroenteritis diseases: headache, vomiting, severe abdominal cramps, and diarrhea. This is particularly important for AIDS patients that may experience a chronic persistent cryptosporidial infection. So humans usually ingest this accidentally via contaminated food or water. This has often occurred from feces of infected animals. The oocyst is going to undergo what's called existing. It's going to exist once it reaches the intestine, and it will then release sporozoites, and those will attach to the epithelium in the small intestine, and then it's going to penetrate the intestinal cells and actually live there. This can undergo both sexual and asexual reproduction, producing more oocysts, which are then in turn released into the gut. And those can be excreted in the feces and become infective once again. So these are very highly infectious, and they can be treatment resistant. So they can also be resistant to chlorine and other disinfectants. Next, we've got rotavirus, which is part of the reovirus. This often infects small children. This is going to be transmitted via the fecal-oral route through usually contaminated food, water, or fomites. Newborns can be protected due to antibodies from the mother. Rotavirus is a very primary cause, a viral cause of morbidity and mortality because of diarrhea. And this is about 50% of all cases. All right, so this is a biggie. You'll see this a lot in child care settings or elementary schools. There is a new oral live vaccine that's available since about 2006. For adults, this is going to be a more milder disease, self-limiting, and again, you'll see the typical symptoms for children and adults: vomiting and diarrhea. Children you will generally see the fever, dehydration, and if not careful, shock. Next, we have norovirus, and this is actually the second most common cause of hospitalizations in the U.S. that occur due to foodborne illnesses. This is actually 5 times more often than Salmonella, but we hear about Salmonella more often because fewer cases require hospitalization than Salmonella. And so transmission is going to be the fecal-oral route with contaminated food and water. Profuse watery diarrhea. You're going to have a 3 to 5 day incubation period, and of course you're going to have vomiting and fever. And treatment is going to be rehydration. Food poisoning. Now we need to remember when we're talking about food poisoning, we're referring to symptoms that are actually caused by the toxin and not an infection, okay? And so food poisoning should be suspected whenever a patient presents with severe nausea and vomiting accompanied by diarrhea. And then when others that have shared the same meal have the same symptoms. Onset is going to last about 1 to 6 hours. And it can be caused by things like Staph aureus, Bacillus cereus, Clostridium perfringens. You can also have non-microbial sources, fish, shellfish, even things like mushrooms, okay? Now, an intoxication, your symptoms are going to be very violent, severe, and the incubation time will be very short. Then you would suspect that you have an intoxication. And some strains of things like Staph aureus can cause a common food intoxication because they produce an enterotoxin. So the Staph aureus exotoxin is going to often be picked up by eating foods like custard, sauces, creams, also processed meats as well. Food can be contaminated by handling or if it is left unrefrigerated for a very long time. If salt has been used to preserve, you can still have Staphylococcus aureus exotoxin because it is tolerant of salt. And so you're not going to, again, when you have a toxin, you're not going to have any change that you can see, smell, or taste in the food. So you're not going to know there is something wrong with it, okay? This enterotoxin or exotoxin is going to be heat stable. To be inactivated, you got to have 30 minutes of at least 100 degrees Celsius, okay? And so heating the food after toxin production may not necessarily prevent the disease. This is going to be a gram-positive bacterium, and you would suspect this in foods that have a high salt or sugar content if someone has an exotoxin or an enterotoxin disease due to that. And so this is going to act on the gastrointestinal epithelium. It can stimulate nerves to cause cramping, nausea, and vomiting and diarrhea. Usually this is going to be short-lived, about 24-hour period. It can come from the food handler's skin, and that can be contaminated that way. Usually this is going to be self-limited, and antibiotics will not be warranted. Bacillus cereus is going to be a gram-positive bacteria that is found normally in the soil. So it can be picked up by vegetables and other products in close contacts with the soil, and it produces two exotoxins. One that can cause a diarrheal type disease, and the other is emetic or a vomiting type disease. The emetic form is often linked to things like fried rice that has been cooked and kept warm for a long period of time, and that provides the conditions that are ideal for the heat-stable exotoxin there. The diarrheal form of the disease is going to be associated with cooked meats or vegetables held for long periods of time. It's going to cause a watery, profuse diarrhea lasting about 24 hours, and proper food handling is the best prevention. So Clostridium perfringens is going to be a gram-positive endospore-forming bacterium that can contaminate many different types of food. Meat and fish are frequently often going to be the ones infected, although you can have vegetables that haven't been cooked thoroughly enough to destroy endospores, cause illness as well. When the foods are cooled, the endospores can actually germinate and the cells can multiply, especially if it's not been refrigerated. If it is eaten without adequate reheating, the live Clostridium perfringens cells can actually enter the intestine and then begin to release the exotoxin. That's going to act on the epithelial cells, causing acute abdominal pain, diarrhea, and nausea in about 8 to 16 hours. Rapid recovery will ensue. Death is very rare. It's going to also sometimes cause, though, an enterocolitis infection that is kind of similar to C. diff, so that could be a little bit more severe form there. So yeah, we're still talking about diarrhea here. So you can have a chronic diarrhea that is defined as lasting more than 14 days, all right? And so this can have an infectious cause, or it can be a non-infectious condition causing this, like irritable bowel syndrome or ulcerative colitis, which are not caused by a microorganism. However, we are finding that a chronic state of a disrupted normal intestinal biota can actually really contribute to these conditions. People suffering from AIDS that have chronic diarrhea are usually going to have causes from an opportunistic microorganism like Cryptosporidium or Mycobacterium. So patients with HIV should be considered, or their HIV status should be considered if a patient persists with a chronic diarrhea. That is something you need to look into. So enteroaggregative E. coli is going to aggregate or be associated with clumps or aggregations of human cells instead of a single cell. Okay, so this is where enteroaggregative comes from. This is going to be gram-negative. It is going to be spread via fecal-oral route, sometimes vehicle transmission by contaminated food or water. This is going to cause about 87% of chronic diarrhea in children. So Cyclospora is going to be our protozoan here. This is going to be something that has been around since the late 1970s that we were able to see anyway. It's going to have a fecal-oral route. Most cases, this is going to be due to consumption of produce that has been contaminated or contaminated water, usually due to feces. This can occur worldwide. It does not spread person to person, okay? All right, so Giardia lamblia, this is another protozoan. It is going to be flagellated. This is one that actually was first observed by Antoine van Leeuwenhoek in his own feces. This is the most common flagellate that is isolated in clinical specimens, and so you see this frequently as far as protozoans go. This is going to have kind of a symmetrical, almost heart kind of shaped. It has organelles that actually look kind of like a face. You can see that over here. It's got these two what look like eye spots. Okay, it almost looks like a little happy face, but I'm pretty sure you're not happy when you have this. Okay, and it's got multiple flagella emerging. The signs and symptoms here, of course, abdominal pain. You'll also see some flatulence and diarrhea as well. Long-term or long-duration diarrhea. Stools will be kind of greasy and very foul-smelling, and you're usually not going to see fever here. And so you're going to have a cyst form here. You're going to have trophozoites and cysts that can escape in the stool. Cysts are going to be a higher mode of transmission. They can survive for up to 2 months in the environment. The cysts are usually going to be ingested with water or food and then swallowed after close contact with people that are infected. The infectious dose is 10 to 100 cysts for prevention and treatment. Well, there's no vaccine. I'm sorry, there is a vaccine. There's no human vaccine, but there is a vaccine that can be given to animals and dogs, okay, just none for humans. And so this is important to avoid drinking fresh water where you don't know if it is clean or not. So prevention is making sure your water is clean. You can treat this with tenodazole. Next, we have Entamoeba. Amoebas are found distributed widely in aqueous habitats, and they're often parasites of animals. But only a few of them have the virulence factors that are needed to invade our tissues and cause a very serious pathology. So Entamoeba histolytica, this is one of the most significant pathogenic amoebas. It has a simple life cycle that alternates between trophozoite and a non-motile or mobile cyst. The trophozoite can actually move via pseudopods, and of course does not have the organelles that many other eukaryotes do. It's basically a single nucleus with a large nucleolus. The mature cysts can be encased in a thin, kind of tough wall. Here you can see the trophozoite with the nucleus and the karyosome, a few red blood cells, and then a mature cyst. Then you can have your stages going through excisement. The cyst is going to be divided into 4 cells, which are called metacysts, and those can differentiate into trophozoites and then be released. You can have intestinal amoebiasis and dysentery, generally of the cecum, and you can see red patches where amoeba have actually damaged the intestinal mucosa here in the picture at the bottom. So this is going to initially target the cecum, as we said, and then maybe move on to the appendix, colon, or rectum. It's going to secrete enzymes that actually dissolve tissues, and that allows it to penetrate deeper layers of the mucosa and leave some underlying ulcerations. Okay, and so this is going to be have symptoms of dysentery, abdominal pain, fever, diarrhea, weight loss. You can have a life-threatening presentation if you have hemorrhage and perforation, appendicitis, or even a tumor-like growth from this. Okay. So this can be serious. This can also evade the viscera of the peritoneal cavity, the liver, and cause abscesses, which are going to be necrotic tissue, and that can have trophozoites develop and cause actually a hepatitis. If you have amoebiasis in the lungs, it's going to be more rare, but it can occur, pulmonary amoebiasis. You can also have organs like the adrenals, the kidney, the brain targeted as well. If it is a severe form, you can have a 10% fatality rate. You can have chronic carriers with this. After recuperation, you can have a cyst formation occur and then an active dysentery because feces then are going to be flushed from the body. And then after recuperation, the cyst can be spread in the feces. Infection is usually going to be accompanied or acquired by contaminated food or drink that have cysts in them, often released by that asymptomatic carrier. This is thought to be about 1/10 of the world's population that are going to be asymptomatic carriers of amoeba. Kills up to about 100,000 people a year. Of course, you're going to see this more often in more tropical areas, in areas where food and water sanitation is substandard, that type of thing. So treatment, of course, is going to be rigorous treatment of water supplies. Regular chlorination is not going to kill the cyst, so you've got to really boil for a period of time or use iodine to prevent this. Treatment is going to be chloroquine or metronidazole. There are some drugs that you can take, of course, to relieve diarrhea and cramps, and then, of course, fluid replacement is very important, fluid and electrolyte replacement.